Okay, here we are talking about the Renaissance, and this is something that we introduced to you this year, but we'll talk more in detail as a sophomore. But we'll call it the beginnings of the modern era. And so as we talk about the Renaissance, how does it seem different from the medieval era? Okay, so you got your note sheet, perhaps nearby if you want to take notes. But the word Renaissance comes from the Italian Rinascimento, which means rebirth. And as you look at the images before you, hopefully you recognize them, can you guess what was reborn at this time? Okay, I'm assuming you've guessed this, right? Classical art, architecture, philosophy, anything from Greece and Rome, right? So when we talk about classical art and these things, we're talking about the Greco-Roman art forms. And so as we explore the sculptures and paintings of the Renaissance, I think you can see the echoes of their past here. I like to also, when I talk about introduce the Renaissance, I like to begin with Michelangelo and his masterpiece of the Sistine Chapel, or one of his masterpieces, I should say, and a great to me, a great symbol of the Renaissance. So this is the central panel of the Sistine Chapel, and by now you probably recognize these figures. God giving life or knowledge to Adam. A lot of historians think maybe Michelangelo is communicating something here with this shape of the brain, right, as the backdrop here, of giving Adam knowledge, of reason. And that's a theme of the Renaissance, right? As man starts to think of things and using his reason, celebrating the great achievements of humans. So the Renaissance begins in Italy, and we have to ask ourselves why. Obviously, it's no coincidence. And if you look at your note sheet, you'll see these boxes to appear in a second. So why does it begin in Italy? First, they're the first area in Europe to really have thriving urban centers. And these are the things we've been talking about for a while, right? The rise of towns as trade increases because of the Crusades, right? Europeans are awakening to, or especially the elite Europeans are getting used to some luxuries, spices, sugar, cloth from the Middle East. So we start to see towns, because trade is increasing, towns are growing, they're trading within Europe. Obviously, when people interact, ideas are being spread, especially the advanced technology and ideas coming in from the Middle East. We also have been talking about the plague and the enormous impact it has on Europe at this time. And as we talked about before, because of the less workers, right, because of so many people died, they could demand these higher wages, right, as employers were desperate. And so we start to see the growth of the middle class, a slow but steady growth. And then wealthy merchants, and some of these wealthier workers have time to invest in art and literature, even sponsor scientists. And so because of this, the wealthy merchant class becomes a second important part of Italy. So, wealthy merchant class. So another unique feature of Italy is, like our ancient Greek friends, there was no one empire, or like their former Roman friends. Each city in Italy had its own government, right, which gave them a lot of independence. And so without kind of a strong nobility and feudal system, you have a higher percentage of people involved in the city, which gave people a lot of chance to improve their social class with hard work. And individual achievement is starting to be recognized more, and so that, of course, helped people work hard. And our great example of this are the Medicis, who started out pretty humble beginnings and eventually rose to become one of the most powerful families in Europe, and eventually owning and operating banks in probably the traditional birthplace of the Renaissance, Florence. So, for example, the Medicis could hire their own private artists, sponsor science, and even explorers. And the third reason why the Renaissance happens in Italy, obviously because the classical heritage of Greece and Rome are on their doorsteps, right? They were living amongst the ruins of the Roman Empire, and they were also then closer to studying the manuscripts, especially through trade with the Ottoman Empire and access to their libraries, which led to the study of humanism, which we'll talk about in a second. Here we are. So, with the rebirth of the ancient values comes some important terms. One of them, secularism. This idea is a focus more on worldly matters rather than just strictly spiritual ones. We'll see some examples of this in a second. Humanism, this just larger intellectual movement that focused on our human potential and achievements, and where best to read that or talk about it in philosophy and literature and poetry. And so the humanities then become a study of these liberal arts. And of course, I think in connection with maybe a little bit with secularism, people begin to write books rather than Latin, but in the common language or the vernacular. And of course, you're familiar with that already with your readings of Dante, right? That he wrote the Divine Comedy in Italian. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the Medici family. So they're from Florence, and they started off pretty, like I said, humble beginnings, and through their intelligence and hard work, and probably luck, they rose to become one of the most powerful families, and they entered in politics and dominated the politics of Florence. And of course, they're most famous for their patronage of the arts. And so here are some of the famous Medicis. And a man closely connected to them, whether he always wanted to be or not, was Niccolo Machiavelli. How's that for my wonderful Italian? And he wrote probably one of the more influential books in European history, The Prince, a short treatise on how a ruler can gain and then keep power. So the politics of the Italian peninsula were tumultuous, especially Florence. And so after getting in trouble with the Medicis and spending some time in prison, spending some time being tortured, he was eventually exiled. And this was a man who had traveled all over Europe, had met with the biggest and the best and the brightest and the most powerful people. And through his study of the current political landscape and then looking back at great Roman and Greek leaders, he started to develop his philosophy. And what was really striking was that it was completely secular. A companion of the time, a contemporary I should say, Erasmus in the northern Europe, he was writing about how to become a Christian prince and becoming a ruler according to Christian principles. And Machiavelli was like, I don't think that's realistic. You know, you can't be a moral person all the time. Sometimes you got to do what you got to do to maintain your power for the good of a state. Not just selfishly to be powerful, but to maintain political stability, something that Italy quite lacked. So other foundational writers, the father of humanism, Petrarch, who wrote about kind of this rebirth of classical knowledge, Castiglione, who wrote The Courtier, and in this book it defined what it meant to be a Renaissance man, that you should ride a horse and be a great soldier, but write poetry and could philosophize on any topic. And this will become like the standard text for educated aristocratic men probably for the next 300 years. So I already put this on your note sheet, but let's take a brief tour of Renaissance art, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in class. But here you have some broad characteristics, right? Classical themes, but also religious themes, sometimes religious themes in a Greco-Roman setting. Maybe the patron is represented in there. But we start to see realistic portrayal of human beings. We're starting to see, the glorification of the human body, and of course perspective and shading to achieve 3D. And this we've talked about in class when we were contrasting that with medieval paintings. And one of the first paintings of the Renaissance here is Giotto, The Lamentation. So you can see pretty realistic human figures, some 3D, but still a very religious piece, right, with the death of Jesus. Okay, so I like to use this example, the School of Athens, which to me is the quintessential Renaissance painting by Raphael, and it's a fresco, which you can see in the Vatican Museum. But here you have this amazing 3D perspective, right? So clearly shown here in the arches. But also everyone here is a Greco-Roman philosopher, a scientist. I think Michelangelo is this guy pouting right here. So even some of Raphael's contemporaries. So again, more Raphael, but the Betrothal of the Virgin, so you still have religious paintings, but you also might have then pagan or Greco-Roman myth subjects as well. And of course, the quintessential man is Leonardo da Vinci, who's considered a Renaissance man, right? Because he could paint, he could sculpt, he was a scientist, an inventor, and one of his more famous paintings here, the Mona Lisa, and here, right, the Last Supper. So while he had secular subjects and was a scientist, still here, the last meal of Jesus, right, still a prominent religious man. My personal favorite, Michelangelo, also a Renaissance man, a painter, a sculptor, an architect, right, designing the domes of not only the cathedral in Florence, but also St. Peter's in Rome. Let's take a look at his sculptures, right? My personal favorite, the Pietà, with Mary and her son just being taken down from the cross, draped across her lap, and David glorifying the biblical hero who took down the giant. And you see, to me, the humanism here, right? The glorification of the human body, right? Man in his ideal form. The love of a mother and her son, and just the way that his body is draped over her, and the look on her face. And sometimes I like to see, look at this hand, right? The detail, the knowledge of the anatomy, and while it calls to mind our Greco-Roman sculptures, you can see the advanced skills, even the veins, right? Are we impressed? Carving this out of marble? Amazing. And of course, his probably most famous masterpiece, and we looked at this already, God and Man. So this is the Sistine Chapel, painted on the ceiling. So he painted this on his back, hanging from scaffolding, and you can see how long that it took him to do this. Okay, so I think we'll pause here, and our next video will be about the Renaissance ideas moving north.